Sarah Martinez stood behind the counter of her small auto repair shop, her calloused hands steady as she counted the day's earnings. The late afternoon sun streamed through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor littered with tools and car parts. At 42, she had been running Martinez Auto Service for 3 years now, ever since her husband Miguel died in a workplace accident that still made her stomach clench when she thought about it. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see a man in an expensive suit walking in. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. Behind him followed 2 other men, both built like linebackers and wearing matching black polo shirts. They spread out slightly as they entered, a formation Sarah recognized from her days growing up in East Los Angeles. "You Sarah Martinez?" the suit asked, pulling out a business card and placing it on the counter without waiting for an answer. Sarah glanced at the card. Victor Castellanos, Real Estate Development. She had heard the name whispered in the neighborhood lately, always followed by worried looks and hushed conversations. "I am. What can I do for you?" Sarah kept her voice level, though her pulse quickened. She had dealt with men like this before. Castellanos smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse, Mrs. Martinez. I want to buy your property." The shop had been Miguel's dream. He had saved every penny for 5 years, working double shifts at the construction site, to buy this small plot of land and the rundown building that came with it. Together, they had transformed it into something special. Miguel handled the heavy mechanical work while Sarah managed the books and dealt with customers. The shop meant everything to her, not just as a business but as a living memorial to the man she loved. "It's not for sale," Sarah said firmly. Castellanos chuckled, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Martinez. It's just a matter of price. I'm offering you $200,000. Cash. That's more than generous for this little place." Sarah knew the land alone was worth at least 3 times that amount. The neighborhood was changing rapidly, with new condos and trendy restaurants popping up everywhere. Property values were skyrocketing, and men like Castellanos were swooping in to capitalize on it. "I said it's not for sale," Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger. One of the men behind Castellanos stepped forward slightly, cracking his knuckles. The sound echoed through the shop like a warning shot. "Mrs. Martinez," Castellanos continued, his tone remaining pleasant but his eyes hardening, "I think you misunderstood me. I'm not really asking. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to sell me this property, and you're going to do it within the next 2 weeks. And if I don't?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Castellanos shrugged. "Well, things have a way of happening to businesses that don't cooperate. Vandalism. Break-ins. Sometimes customers stop coming around when they don't feel safe. Sometimes the city finds code violations that require expensive fixes. You understand?" Sarah understood perfectly. She had seen it happen to other small business owners in the neighborhood. The Martinez family had owned their house just 2 blocks away, and she remembered her grandmother telling stories about men like this from the old country. They used fear and violence to take what they wanted, hiding behind expensive lawyers and legitimate business fronts. "I need time to think about it," Sarah said, stalling for time. "You have until next Friday," Castellanos said, collecting his business card from the counter. "After that, well, I can't guarantee your safety or the safety of your business." The 3 men turned and walked toward the door. As Castellanos reached for the handle, he paused and looked back at Sarah. "By the way, Mrs. Martinez, I know you live alone now. That big empty house must get lonely at night. Dangerous too, for a woman by herself." The threat was crystal clear. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her expression neutral until the men left. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto the stool behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she processed what had just happened. That evening, Sarah sat in her kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The house felt enormous around her, every creak and settling sound making her jump. She thought about Miguel and how he would have handled this situation. He had been a gentleman, but he also had grown up hard and knew how to take care of himself and his family. Sarah wasn't naive about the world. She had grown up in a neighborhood where women learned early how to be strong, how to protect themselves and their families. Her mother had raised 4 children alone after Sarah's father left, working 3 jobs and never backing down from anyone who tried to intimidate her. Sarah had inherited that strength, but she had never faced anything quite like this before. The next morning, Sarah opened the shop as usual. She had made a decision during her sleepless night, but she wasn't ready to act on it yet. She needed to gather information first, to understand exactly what she was dealing with. Her first customer was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman whose ancient Honda Civic needed regular maintenance to keep running. As Sarah checked the oil and replaced the air filter, Mrs. Chen chatted about neighborhood gossip. "That developer, he's been bothering everyone," Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head. "The Johnsons down the street, they sold to him last month. Said they didn't have a choice after someone broke all their windows twice in 1 week." "Did they call the police?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. "Of course they called. Police said there was no evidence of who did it." "Very convenient, don't you think?" Throughout the day, Sarah heard similar stories from other customers. Castellanos had a pattern. He targeted small business owners and elderly homeowners, people he thought would be easy to intimidate. He made reasonable offers at first, but if people refused, things started happening. Vandalism. Harassment. Sometimes worse. Sarah learned that Castellanos had connections throughout the city government and the police department. Several of her customers mentioned seeing him having lunch with city councilmen and judges. He operated with impunity because he had bought protection at every level. But Sarah also learned something else. There were other business owners who had refused to sell and had found ways to fight back. Tony Ricci, who owned the Italian restaurant 3 blocks over, had stood up to Castellanos 6 months ago. His restaurant was still open and thriving. That afternoon, Sarah decided to pay Tony a visit. Ricci's Italian kitchen was busy for a Wednesday afternoon, filled with the smell of garlic and the sound of animated conversation. Tony Ricci was a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. "Sarah Martinez," Tony said with a warm smile when she approached his table in the back corner of the restaurant. "I've been expecting you." "You have?" "Word travels fast in this neighborhood. Castellanos paid me a visit 6 months ago, and I heard through the grapevine that he's been making his rounds again." "Sit down, let me buy you lunch." Over plates of homemade pasta, Tony told Sarah his story. Castellanos had used the same tactics with him, but Tony had refused to be intimidated. He had grown up in Brooklyn and had dealt with men like Castellanos before. "The key," Tony explained, "is not to show fear. Men like him, they feed on fear. If you show them you're afraid, they know they've got you." "But what about the threats? The vandalism?" Tony's expression darkened. "It happened. They broke my windows twice. Spray-painted the walls. Harassed my customers. But I didn't back down, and I fought back smart." "What do you mean?" "I documented everything. Pictures, videos, witness statements. I hired a good lawyer, not one of the scared ones that Castellanos has in his pocket. And I made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what was happening. Bad publicity is the one thing men like Castellanos can't stand." Tony leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But, most importantly, I let him know that I wasn't someone he could push around. I have connections too, Sarah. Different kinds of connections." Sarah understood. Tony had grown up in a world where respect was earned through strength, and he still had friends who remembered how to handle problems that the law couldn't touch. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," Tony continued. "But sometimes you have to speak a language that bullies understand." That evening, Sarah sat in her living room, looking through photo albums from her life with Miguel. She found a picture from their wedding day, both of them young and hopeful, standing in front of the small church where they had pledged to love each other until death do them part. Miguel had been gone for 3 years now, but Sarah could still hear his voice clearly in her memory. He used to tell her that she was the strongest person he knew, stronger than him in ways that mattered most. He said she had the heart of a warrior hidden behind a gentle smile. Looking at their wedding photo, Sarah made another decision. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to be intimidated. The shop was all she had left of Miguel, and she would fight to keep it. But she was going to be smart about it. The next day, Sarah took a personal day from the shop and spent it making preparations. First, she visited a lawyer recommended by Tony Ricci, a tough woman named Carmen Rodriguez who specialized in cases involving intimidation and harassment. Carmen listened to Sarah's story and agreed to represent her pro bono, saying that she had been waiting for someone brave enough to take on Castellanos. "He's been terrorizing this neighborhood for too long," Carmen said. "But we need evidence. Lots of it. And we need you to be very careful." Next, Sarah visited a security company and had cameras installed around her shop and her house. She also purchased a security system that would alert the police and a private security firm if anyone tried to break in. Finally, Sarah made a stop that would have surprised anyone who knew her well. She drove to a gym across town, a place that didn't advertise and required a personal referral to join. The man who owned it was named Eduardo Vega, and he had been Miguel's best friend since childhood. Eduardo was a former boxer who now trained fighters and taught self-defense classes to women who needed to learn how to protect themselves. When Sarah explained her situation, his face grew dark with anger. "Miguel always said you were tougher than you looked," Eduardo said. "Let's find out how tough." For the rest of that week, Sarah spent her evenings at Eduardo's gym. She learned how to throw a proper punch, how to use her keys as a weapon, and how to spot potential threats before they became immediate dangers. More importantly, she learned how to project confidence even when she felt afraid. The most important thing, Eduardo told her, is to never let them see doubt in your eyes. Men like Castellanos, they're predators. They can smell fear from a mile away. But they also know the difference between someone who's just pretending to be tough and someone who's actually dangerous. "I don't feel dangerous," Sarah admitted. "You will," Eduardo promised. Friday afternoon arrived faster than Sarah had expected. She spent the morning servicing cars and trying to act normally, but her stomach was tight with nervous energy. At exactly 3 o'clock, Castellanos walked through her door again, accompanied by the same 2 men as before. This time, Sarah was ready for them. She stood up from behind the counter, her posture straight and her hands steady. The week of training with Eduardo had taught her how to carry herself like someone who wasn't afraid, and she could see the slight surprise in Castellanos' eyes as he noticed the change in her demeanor. "Mrs. Martinez," Castellanos said, his tone less friendly than before. "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer." "I have," Sarah replied calmly. "And my answer is still no." Castellanos sighed dramatically, as if he were disappointed but not surprised. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this matter amicably." "We can," Sarah said. "You can leave my property and never come back." One of the men behind Castellanos stepped forward again, but this time Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and smiled slightly. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that said she knew something he didn't, and that something might be dangerous for him. The man hesitated, clearly unsure how to interpret her reaction. "Mrs. Martinez," Castellanos continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. You're a woman alone in the world. Accidents happen to women alone. Sometimes they happen in their homes late at night. Sometimes they happen in empty parking lots. Sometimes they happen right here in their little shops." Sarah's smile widened, and she tilted her head slightly to one side. The gesture was almost playful, as if Castellanos had just told her an amusing joke instead of threatening her life. "Mr. Castellanos," Sarah said, her voice still calm and steady, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation." She reached under the counter and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the surface between them. This contains photographs of you and your men leaving my shop last week, along with a transcript of everything you said. It also contains security footage from the cameras I had installed this week, which are currently recording this conversation." Castellanos' face darkened, but Sarah wasn't finished. "This folder also contains documentation of every other business owner and homeowner you've threatened in this neighborhood, along with witness statements and evidence of the vandalism and harassment that followed their refusal to sell." Sarah opened the folder and pulled out a business card, placing it next to Castellanos' real estate card from the week before. "This one belonged to Carmen Rodriguez, attorney at law. My lawyer is very interested in filing a racketeering lawsuit against you and your organization. Apparently, there's a federal task force that's been looking into your business practices for quite some time." For the first time since walking into her shop, Castellanos looked uncertain. The federal government was the one entity he couldn't intimidate or buy off easily. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sarah's smile never wavered. "Am I?" She reached under the counter again and pulled out her cell phone, holding it where Castellanos could see the screen. On it was a text message conversation with someone identified only as Detective Martinez, FBI. The messages were clearly visible, status updates about an ongoing investigation into organized intimidation and extortion in the neighborhood. "You see, Mr. Castellanos, you made a mistake when you chose to threaten me. You assumed I was just a scared widow who would roll over and give you what you wanted. But you didn't do your research." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, though she never raised it above a conversational level. "Miguel Martinez wasn't just my husband. He was also the younger brother of Detective Roberto Martinez, who works for the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. Roberto has been looking for a way to bring you down for months, and I just handed him everything he needs." The two men behind Castellanos shifted nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating. Castellanos himself had gone pale, realizing that he had walked into a trap. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "this neighborhood isn't as defenseless as you thought. We've organized. We've documented everything. And we've decided to fight back." As if on cue, the bell above the door chimed again. Tony Ricci walked in, followed by Eduardo Vega and 3 other men Sarah didn't recognize but who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who knew how to handle trouble. "Gentlemen," Tony said pleasantly, "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." Castellanos looked around the shop, suddenly realizing that he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The predator had become the prey, and he didn't like the feeling. "This isn't over," he said, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. Sarah's smile finally faded, replaced by an expression of cold determination that would have made Miguel proud. "Yes, it is," she said quietly. "And if you or any of your people come near me, my shop, or anyone else in this neighborhood again, you'll discover just how much trouble a widow with nothing left to lose can cause." Castellanos and his men left without another word, and Sarah knew she had won the first round. But she also knew that men like Castellanos didn't give up easily, and the real fight was just beginning. The weekend after Sarah's confrontation with Castellanos passed quietly, almost too quietly. She kept the shop open on Saturday as usual, servicing cars and chatting with customers who had heard through the neighborhood grapevine about what had happened. Word traveled fast in their tight-knit community, and Sarah found herself becoming something of a local hero to people who had felt powerless against Castellanos' intimidation tactics. But, beneath the surface, Sarah remained vigilant. Men like Castellanos didn't simply disappear when faced with resistance. They regrouped, planned, and struck back harder. She knew this was just the calm before a much more dangerous storm. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived at the shop to find a surprise waiting for her. Detective Roberto Martinez, Miguel's older brother, was leaning against her front door with 2 cups of coffee and a serious expression on his weathered face. "Hello, little sister," Roberto said, using the affectionate nickname he had called her since she married Miguel 15 years ago. Sarah hugged him tightly, drawing comfort from his presence. Roberto was 10 years older than Miguel had been, a career law enforcement officer who had worked his way up from beat cop to FBI detective through sheer determination and an unwavering sense of justice. "I heard you've been stirring up trouble," Roberto said as Sarah unlocked the shop door.
I've been defending what's mine, Sarah replied firmly.
Inside the shop, Roberto handed her one of the coffees and studied her face carefully.
You look different. Stronger somehow. I feel different, Sarah admitted.
For 3 years, I've been living like a ghost, just going through the motions. But, when Castellanos walked in here and threatened me, something woke up inside me.
Roberto nodded approvingly. Miguel always said you had fire in you.
He was proud of that. They sat together on 2 folding chairs in the shop's small office, and Roberto filled Sarah in on what he knew about Castellanos' operation. It was bigger and more sophisticated than Sarah had realized, with tentacles reaching into construction, real estate, waste management, and even some legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering.
The problem is proving it, Roberto explained. Castellanos is smart. He keeps himself insulated from the actual crimes.
He gives orders, but never directly. He uses intermediaries and maintains plausible deniability.
But what about all the evidence Carmen and I have been gathering?
It's good, and it's helpful, but it's not enough for a federal case. We need someone on the inside willing to testify, or we need to catch Castellanos red-handed ordering something illegal. Sarah sipped her coffee and considered this.
What if we could give you both? What do you mean?
I've been researching Castellanos' operation for months, ever since he started targeting businesses in this area.
I think I've found his weakness.
She turned the legal pad so both Sarah and Roberto could see her handwriting.
Castellanos has a pattern.
When intimidation doesn't work, he escalates in very specific ways. First, he tries bribery.
Then, he uses harassment and vandalism.
If that doesn't work, he arranges for city inspectors to find code violations that require expensive repairs.
We know all this, Roberto said impatiently.
But, here's what you don't know, Carmen continued. If all of that fails, Castellanos has one final tactic.
He arranges for accidents.
House fires.
Gas leaks. Car crashes.
Always carefully arranged to look accidental, but suspicious enough that the message is clear to other potential holdouts. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine.
You think he's planning to kill me?
I think he's already decided to, Carmen said bluntly.
The question is when and how. And that's where our opportunity lies. Roberto stood up and began pacing around the small office. You're talking about using Sarah as bait. Absolutely not.
I'm talking about giving Castellanos exactly what he wants while making sure we're ready for him, Carmen replied.
Sarah has already proven she's not going to be intimidated. Castellanos can't back down now without looking weak to his organization and his other victims. So he's going to escalate.
Carmen turned to face Sarah directly. The question is whether we let him choose the time and place, or whether we force his hand and control the situation.
I'm listening, Sarah said, despite Roberto's obvious disapproval.
Here's what I'm thinking, Carmen continued.
We leak information that suggests you're about to go public with everything you know. Maybe hint that you're planning to give an interview to a newspaper or a TV station. Castellanos will panic and move quickly to silence you before you can talk. And then?
Then, we're ready for him.
Roberto's people will be watching.
We'll have everything recorded. And, when Castellanos or his people come for you, we'll have them on federal charges that will put them away for life. Roberto stopped pacing and fixed both women with a hard stare.
This plan assumes that my people can protect Sarah when Castellanos makes his move. What if we're not fast enough? What if something goes wrong?
Then, I die, Sarah said simply. But, at least I'll die fighting instead of living in fear.
The room fell silent for a long moment. Finally, Roberto sighed and sat back down.
If we're going to do this, he said slowly, we're going to do it right.
Full surveillance.
Backup plans. And, at the first sign that things are going sideways, we pull you out.
Agreed, Sarah said immediately.
Carmen smiled for the first time since entering the shop.
There's something else you should know.
I've been in contact with some of Castellanos' other victims. They're willing to testify once we have him in custody. They've just been too afraid to come forward while he's still free.
How many people are we talking about?
Roberto asked.
17 business owners and homeowners.
Plus 3 former employees of his organization who are willing to talk in exchange for protection. Roberto whistled softly.
That's a federal racketeering case all by itself.
Exactly. But we need Castellanos to incriminate himself directly.
The conspiracy charges won't stick without his voice on tape giving orders. They spent the next 2 hours planning every detail of their trap.
Carmen would leak the story to a journalist friend of hers who specialized in corruption cases. The story would suggest that Sarah Martinez, a local business owner, was planning to expose a widespread extortion scheme operating in the neighborhood.
Roberto would coordinate with his FBI team to maintain 24-hour surveillance on Sarah and her property.
They would also monitor Castellanos and his known associates, watching for any indication that he was planning retaliation. Sarah's role was the most dangerous but also the most important. She had to continue acting normally while making herself an irresistible target for Castellanos. She would be wired for sound during business hours and have panic buttons installed in both her shop and her home.
Remember, Roberto warned her, these people are professionals. They'll be looking for signs that this is a setup.
You can't act scared, but you also can't act too confident. You need to seem like someone who's made a brave decision but is still vulnerable.
I understand, Sarah said. As Carmen and Roberto prepared to leave, Sarah felt a moment of doubt. Was she really ready for this? Was she putting her life at risk for the right reasons, or was she just letting grief and anger cloud her judgment? Roberto seemed to sense her hesitation.
He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and spoke quietly.
Miguel would be proud of you, Sarah.
Not because you're willing to fight, but because you're fighting for the right reasons. You're not just defending your shop. You're defending your whole community. After they left, Sarah spent the rest of the day trying to act normally. She serviced cars, chatted with customers, and handled the routine business of running a garage. But, underneath the surface, she felt like a different person than she had been just a week ago. The old Sarah would have been terrified at the thought of deliberately provoking a dangerous criminal. The old Sarah would have sold the shop and moved away, choosing safety over principle. But the woman she had become over the past week was stronger than that. She was the woman Miguel had always believed she could be. That evening, Sarah called her sister Elena in Phoenix. Elena was 2 years younger and had always been the cautious one in the family.
When Sarah explained what she was planning to do, Elena's reaction was predictable. "Are you insane?" Elena shouted over the phone.
"Sell the damn shop and come live with us. David and I have plenty of room, and the kids would love to have their aunt nearby."
"This isn't just about the shop anymore, Elena. It's about standing up to bullies. It's about making sure other people don't have to go through what I've been through. It's about getting yourself killed for no good reason," Elena shot back. "Miguel wouldn't want this. He'd want you to be safe." Sarah considered this for a moment. Would Miguel want her to take this risk?
She thought about the man she had married, the man who had worked 2 jobs to save enough money to buy the shop, the man who had never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake.
"Maybe you're right," Sarah said finally. "Maybe Miguel wouldn't want me to do this."
But the Sarah that Miguel fell in love with would do it anyway.
Elena was quiet for a long moment.
When she spoke again, her voice was softer but still worried.
"Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks."
"I promise," Sarah said, though they both knew that the entire plan was built on taking risks.
The next morning brought the first test of Sarah's resolve.
She arrived at the shop to find graffiti spray painted across her front windows. The words were crude and threatening, clearly meant to intimidate her. But, instead of fear, Sarah felt a surge of anger and determination. She took photographs of the graffiti before cleaning it off, documenting everything as Roberto had instructed her to do. She also noticed a van parked across the street with tinted windows and a man sitting behind the wheel. When she waved at him cheerfully, the van drove away quickly. Castellanos was already watching her, which meant the trap was beginning to work. Around noon, Carmen called to let Sarah know that the newspaper story would run in tomorrow's edition. The headline would read, "Local business owner prepares to expose neighborhood extortion ring." It was exactly the kind of story that would force Castellanos to act quickly. That afternoon, Sarah had an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman with the ancient Honda, came into the shop looking nervous and upset. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Chen said in a whisper, "I think someone has been watching my house. There's been a strange car parked outside for 3 days now." Sarah felt a stab of guilt. By standing up to Castellanos, had she put her customers and neighbors in danger? "Mrs. Chen, I need you to be very careful for the next few weeks. If you see anything suspicious, call the police immediately. And maybe stay with your daughter for a while. This is about that developer, isn't it? The one who's been bothering everyone." Sarah nodded reluctantly. Mrs. Chen surprised her by reaching across the counter and patting her hand gently. "My late husband fought in Korea. He used to say that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous. I don't want anyone to get hurt because of me," Sarah said. "People are already getting hurt, dear. You're just the first one brave enough to fight back." That evening, Sarah had dinner with Tony Ricci and his wife Maria. Tony wanted to review the security arrangements one more time and make sure Sarah understood the risks she was taking. "Once that newspaper story comes out," Tony warned, "there's no going back. Castellanos will see you as an existential threat to his operation." "Good," Sarah said. "Maybe it's time someone threatened him for a change." Maria Ricci studied Sarah's face across the dinner table. "You've changed, honey. When I first met you 3 years ago, you seemed lost. Broken. Now you look like a woman who knows exactly who she is." Sarah considered this observation. Maybe grief isn't just about losing someone. Maybe it's also about finding out who you are when everything familiar is stripped away. "Miguel would be proud," Tony said simply. As Sarah drove home that night, she noticed that she was being followed by a dark sedan. Instead of panicking, she felt oddly calm. Roberto had told her this would happen, and she was ready for it. She led the sedan on a deliberately circuitous route through the neighborhood, giving Roberto's surveillance team time to identify and photograph whoever was following her. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the sedan drove past without stopping. Inside her house, Sarah checked in with Roberto via a secure phone he had given her. "We got pictures of your tail," Roberto reported. "2 of Castellanos' regular muscle. They're not trying to be subtle anymore." "What does that mean?" "It means they're getting ready to make their move. Probably within the next day or 2. Sarah felt her stomach clench with nervous anticipation. "I'm ready." "No, you're not," Roberto said gently. "Nobody's ever really ready for something like this. But you're brave, and you're smart, and you have good people watching your back. That's going to have to be enough." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her living room and looked at the wedding photos on the mantelpiece. Tomorrow, the newspaper story would come out, and her life would change forever. Either she would help bring down a criminal organization that had been terrorizing her community, or she would become another victim of Victor Castellanos. But, as she looked at Miguel's smiling face in those old photographs, Sarah knew she had already made her choice. She was no longer the grieving widow who had been hiding from life for 3 years. She was the woman Miguel had always believed she could be, strong, determined, and unafraid to fight for what was right. The Widowmaker was ready for war. The newspaper story hit the streets at dawn on Wednesday morning, and, by 8 o'clock, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters from 3 different television stations wanted interviews. Neighbors called to offer support or express concern. Even her insurance agent called to discuss increasing her coverage, which Sarah found darkly amusing. But the call that mattered most came at 9:30 from Roberto. It worked, he said tersely. Our wiretaps picked up Castellanos on the phone 20 minutes after the paper hit the stands. He's furious, and he's ordered his people to handle the situation immediately. Sarah felt her pulse quicken.
What exactly did he say?
He told them to make it look like an accident, but to send a clear message to anyone else thinking about talking to the press.
He wants it done tonight. How do you want to handle this?
We're going to let them come, Roberto said. But we'll be ready. I've got a full tactical team positioned around your property. We've also got undercover agents watching Castellanos and his known associates.
What about the shop?
We think they'll hit your house first. It's more isolated, and it sends a more personal message. But we've got both locations covered. After hanging up, Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine at the shop, but concentration was difficult.
Every customer who walked through the door could be one of Castellanos' people.
Every strange noise outside made her jump. The weight of the wire recorder hidden under her shirt felt heavier with each passing hour. Around noon, a man she didn't recognize came into the shop. He was dressed like a construction worker, complete with work boots and a hard hat, but something about him set off alarm bells in Sarah's head. His hands were too clean for someone who worked with his hands all day, and he kept looking around the shop as if he were memorizing the layout.
Help you with something?
Sarah asked, keeping her voice casual while her hand moved slowly toward the panic button Roberto had installed under the counter.
Yeah, my truck's been making a weird noise, the man said. Thought maybe you could take a look at it.
What kind of truck?
The man hesitated for just a moment too long.
Ford.
F-150.
What year?
Another hesitation. 2018.
Sarah knew immediately that this man had never owned a 2018 F-150. The hesitation in his voice, combined with his obvious nervousness, marked him as someone who was lying. This was either one of Castellanos' scouts or someone sent to test her defenses.
I'm pretty booked up today, Sarah said. You might want to try Martinez Auto Service down the street. The man's face showed confusion.
Isn't this Martinez Auto Service?
Sarah smiled pleasantly.
No, this is Rodriguez Auto Repair.
Martinez is about 6 blocks that way.
She pointed in the wrong direction deliberately. Oh, sorry, the man said, clearly flustered by the unexpected response.
My mistake.
After he left, Sarah called Roberto immediately. They're probing, she reported. Someone just came in pretending to be a customer, but he was obviously casing the place. We saw him, Roberto confirmed.
We've got eyes on your location.
Did he ask any specific questions? He was trying to confirm this was the right place. I threw him off by claiming to be a different shop.
Good thinking. That might buy us some time.
But Sarah knew time was running out. The man's visit confirmed that Castellanos was moving forward with his plan. Tonight, they would come for her. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Sarah serviced 2 cars and tried to act normally, but she found herself checking the security cameras Roberto had installed every few minutes. The unmarked FBI surveillance van parked down the street was both reassuring and terrifying. Its presence meant protection, but it also meant the danger was real. As closing time approached, Sarah began her usual end-of-day routine. She balanced the cash register, cleaned her tools, and locked the expensive equipment in the secure storage room. But tonight, she also performed some additional tasks that weren't part of her normal routine. She checked the small digital recorder hidden in her toolbox to make sure it was working. She tested the panic alarm that would summon both the FBI and local police. And she reviewed the escape routes Roberto had mapped out for her in case everything went wrong. At 6 o'clock, Sarah locked up the shop and drove home, once again noticing that she was being followed. This time it was a different car, a blue sedan with 2 men inside. They made no effort to hide their surveillance, which suggested they wanted her to know she was being watched. At home, Sarah made herself a simple dinner but found she had no appetite. Instead, she sat in her kitchen and called Elena in Phoenix.
How are you holding up? Elena asked, her voice tight with worry. I'm scared, Sarah admitted. But, I'm also ready for this to be over. It's not too late to back out.
You could still disappear, go somewhere safe until the FBI handles this.
We've been through this, Elena. Running away won't solve anything. Castellanos would just find other victims to intimidate.
But, why does it have to be you?
Why can't someone else take this risk? Sarah considered the question seriously.
Because I'm the one who said no first.
Because I'm the one who stood up to him. And, because Miguel always taught me that when you start something important, you finish it.
They talked for another hour, mostly about family memories and happier times. Sarah found it comforting to remember her childhood, when the biggest worry she had was whether she would pass her math test or if the boy she liked would notice her at school. At 10 o'clock, Sarah said goodbye to her sister and began her final preparations for the night ahead. She changed into dark clothing that would make her less visible in the shadows. She checked the locations of all the FBI equipment Roberto had installed throughout the house. And she went through a mental checklist of everything she was supposed to do if Castellanos' people came for her. The plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah would stay in the house and act normally until the attackers revealed their intentions clearly enough to be recorded.
Only then would the FBI move in to arrest them.
The risk was that something could go wrong in the few minutes between the attackers entering the house and the FBI reaching her. At 11:30, Sarah turned off most of the lights in the house and went through the motions of getting ready for bed. She knew that Castellanos' people were watching and that they would wait until they were sure she was asleep before making their move. But, instead of going to bed, Sarah positioned herself in the living room where she could see both the front and back entrances to the house. She had a clear view of the street through the front window, and the recording equipment would pick up any conversation that took place in the room.
At 12:15, Sarah saw movement outside.
2 men dressed in black were walking up her driveway, moving with the practiced silence of people who had done this kind of thing before. A third man remained by a van parked on the street, apparently serving as a lookout. Sarah's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm.
This was the moment everything had been building toward.
The men reached her front door and began working on the lock with professional tools. They weren't trying to break in violently, they wanted to enter quietly without waking the neighbors or triggering any obvious alarms. Within minutes, they had the front door open. Sarah heard the soft whisper of footsteps in her hallway as the men entered the house. She remained perfectly still, knowing that Roberto and his team were watching everything through the hidden cameras.
The footsteps moved through the house methodically as the intruders searched for her.
Sarah could hear them checking the kitchen, the dining room, and the guest bedroom. They were being careful not to make noise, but they were also thorough. When the footsteps reached the hallway outside the living room, Sarah knew she had to act. She turned on a table lamp and sat up on the couch as if she had been sleeping there. "Who's there?" she called out, putting just the right amount of fear and confusion in her voice. 2 men stepped into the living room, both wearing dark clothing and carrying guns with silencers attached. They moved with the calm efficiency of professionals, and Sarah realized that these weren't just street thugs hired for intimidation. These were killers. "Sarah Martinez?" the taller man asked. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly.
"What do you want?" "Mr. Castellanos sends his regards," the man said. "He wants you to know that people who don't mind their own business sometimes have accidents." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though her hand was slowly moving toward the panic button hidden in the couch cushions. "You talked to that newspaper reporter," the second man said. "That was a mistake. A fatal mistake." The taller man raised his gun slightly. "We're going to make this look like a home invasion gone wrong. Just another widow who didn't have enough security." Sarah found the panic button and pressed it, sending a silent alarm to Roberto and his team. But she also knew that she needed to keep the men talking long enough for the recording equipment to capture clear evidence of Castellanos' involvement. "Castellanos ordered this?" she asked. "He doesn't like people who cause trouble for his business," the tall man confirmed. "Consider this a message to anyone else who might be thinking about talking to the press.
Suddenly, Sarah heard the sound of vehicles approaching the house rapidly. Car doors slammed, and she could hear men shouting orders outside.
The FBI had arrived.
The two gunmen looked at each other in alarm, clearly realizing they had walked into a trap.
Federal agents, a voice shouted from outside. The house is surrounded.
The shorter gunman cursed and started toward the back of the house, looking for an escape route. But the taller man kept his gun trained on Sarah.
"This is your fault," he snarled. "You should have minded your own business."
Sarah looked into his eyes and saw her own death there. Roberto and his team were outside, but they might not reach her in time. For a moment, she felt the same paralyzing fear that had consumed her life for 3 years after Miguel's death.
Then, she remembered Eduardo's training.
She remembered the strength she had found within herself over the past week. She remembered Miguel's voice telling her that she was braver than she knew. "No," Sarah said firmly, standing up from the couch.
"I should have done this a long time ago."
Before the gunman could react, Sarah threw herself sideways behind the heavy oak coffee table Miguel had built with his own hands. The man's shot went wild, the bullet embedding itself in the wall where she had been sitting.
At the same moment, the front door exploded inward as FBI agents stormed into the house.
Sarah heard shouting, running footsteps, and more gunshots.
The second gunman had apparently decided to shoot his way out rather than surrender. "Sarah!"
Roberto's voice called out.
"Where are you?"
"Here," she shouted from behind the coffee table.
"I'm okay." The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds.
When the shooting stopped, Roberto found Sarah crouched behind the coffee table, shaken but unharmed. The taller gunman was on the ground, wounded but alive. The shorter one had been killed trying to escape through the back door.
"Are you hurt?"
Roberto asked, helping her to her feet.
"No," Sarah said, though her hands were trembling. "I'm okay." "Did we get what we needed?" "We got everything," Roberto confirmed.
Both men on tape admitting they were sent by Castellanos.
Plus, the one who's still alive is already asking about a plea bargain.
Outside, Sarah could see the neighborhood coming alive as people emerged from their houses to see what had happened. Police cars and FBI vehicles filled the street, their red and blue lights painting everything in surreal colors.
Carmen Rodriguez arrived within minutes, having monitored the FBI radio frequency throughout the night.
She looked relieved to see Sarah unharmed but also grimly satisfied that their plan had worked.
"How long before you can arrest Castellanos?" Sarah asked.
"The warrant's already been issued," Roberto said.
"Teams are moving on his house and his business offices right now. By morning, Victor Castellanos will be in federal custody."
As if to punctuate his words, Roberto's radio crackled with reports from other FBI teams.
Castellanos had been arrested without incident at his home. 3 of his top lieutenants were also in custody.
The search of his business offices had already turned up evidence of money laundering and bribery. Sarah sat down heavily in her damaged living room, finally, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened.
She had survived. More importantly, she had won.
"What happens now?" she asked. "Now you get to go back to your life," Roberto said.
"The real one. The one where you don't have to be afraid anymore."
As the FBI agents processed the crime scene and the paramedics treated the wounded gunman, Sarah walked out onto her front porch. The night air felt cool against her skin, and she realized that for the first time in years, she could breathe freely. The Widowmaker had faced down death and emerged victorious. But, more than that, she had found herself again. The frightened, grieving woman who had hidden from life for 3 years was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger and more determined than she had ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be a trial, and she would have to testify against dangerous people who would probably try to intimidate her again. There would be reporters and lawyers and 100 small complications. But tonight, standing on her front porch and watching the last of the police cars drive away, Sarah Martinez felt something she hadn't experienced since Miguel's death: peace. She was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the federal courthouse downtown, adjusting her navy blue suit as she prepared to give the most important testimony of her life. The months since Castellanos' arrest had transformed both her life and the entire neighborhood, but this trial represented the final chapter of a story that had begun with a simple threat in her auto repair shop. The courtroom was packed with faces Sarah had come to know well over the past half year. There was Mrs. Chen, who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Sarah since the night of the FBI raid. Tony and Maria Ricci sat in the front row, having testified earlier in the week about their own experiences with Castellanos' intimidation tactics. Carmen Rodriguez was at the prosecutor's table, having been appointed as a special federal prosecutor for this case due to her extensive knowledge of the defendant's criminal activities. And there was Roberto, sitting with the other FBI agents who had worked the case. He gave Sarah an encouraging nod as she walked toward the witness stand. Over the past 6 months, Roberto had become more than just her brother-in-law, he had become her closest friend and confidant as she navigated the complex legal process that followed Castellanos' arrest. Victor Castellanos himself sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 expensive lawyers. He looked smaller than Sarah remembered from their confrontations at the shop. Prison had not been kind to him. His expensive suits had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and his earlier arrogance had given way to the hollow-eyed look of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. The prosecution calls Sarah Martinez to the stand, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, a young prosecutor who had worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against Castellanos. As Sarah walked to the witness stand, she thought about how much her life had changed since that first day when Castellanos had walked into her shop. The frightened widow who had simply wanted to be left alone had evolved into a woman who now spoke regularly at community meetings about standing up to neighborhood crime. She had become an advocate for other small business owners facing similar threats, working with Carmen to provide legal resources and support. But, perhaps more importantly, she had rediscovered her sense of purpose. The auto repair shop was busier than ever, not just because of the publicity from the case, but because Sarah had thrown herself into the business with renewed passion. She had hired 2 part-time mechanics and was considering expanding to include a small parts store. "Please state your name for the record," Prosecutor Chen said once Sarah had been sworn in. "Sarah Elena Martinez," she replied, her voice clear and strong. "Mrs. Martinez, do you see the defendant, Victor Castellanos, in the courtroom today?" "Yes, I do." Sarah looked directly at Castellanos as she spoke. He met her gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Can you point him out for the jury?" Sarah raised her hand and pointed at Castellanos. "He's sitting at the defense table wearing the orange jumpsuit." For the next 2 hours, Sarah recounted the entire story for the jury. She described the first visit when Castellanos had threatened her, the weeks of intimidation that followed, and the night when his gunman had broken into her home with orders to kill her. Throughout her testimony, Sarah remained calm and composed. The months of preparation with prosecutors and FBI agents had taught her to stick to the facts and avoid emotional outbursts that defense lawyers might use to undermine her credibility. But, when Prosecutor Chen asked her to describe the moment when the gunman had pointed his weapon at her and admitted he was acting on Castellanos' orders, Sarah's voice carried the full weight of that terrifying experience. "He said Mr. Castellanos wanted to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking about talking to the press," Sarah testified. "He said they were going to make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. Just another widow who didn't have enough security." Several jury members visibly reacted to this testimony, and Sarah could see that her words were having the intended impact. The defense lawyers objected repeatedly, but Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who had been presiding over federal criminal cases for 20 years, consistently overruled them. When it came time for cross-examination, Castellanos' lead defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Webb who specialized in defending organized crime figures, attempted to portray Sarah as a vengeful woman who had fabricated evidence to frame an innocent businessman. "Mrs. Martinez," Webb began in a condescending tone, "isn't it true that you were still grieving your husband's death when these alleged incidents occurred?" "I was grieving, yes," Sarah replied. "But that doesn't mean I imagined what happened." Grief can affect one's perception of events, can't it? It can make someone see threats where none exist. Sarah had been prepared for this line of questioning. "Mr. Webb, if I had imagined these threats,
how do you explain the physical evidence? The recordings? The photographs? The testimony of 17 other victims who experienced identical intimidation tactics?
Webb tried several more approaches, attempting to suggest that Sarah had conspired with law enforcement to entrap his client, but Sarah's responses were consistently clear and factual. She had learned to let the evidence speak for itself rather than getting drawn into emotional arguments. The most dramatic moment of her testimony came when Webb made the mistake of suggesting that Sarah should have simply sold her property and avoided the entire conflict.
Mrs. Martinez, Webb said, wouldn't it have been simpler to just accept Mr. Castellanos' generous offer and move on with your life?
Sarah looked at the lawyer for a long moment, then turned to address the jury directly. "My husband died building that business," she said quietly.
"He worked 16-hour days and saved every penny for 5 years to buy that property. It represents everything he dreamed of achieving in America."
Mr. Castellanos wanted to steal that dream with threats and violence.
Should I have let him?
Webb had no effective response to this question, and his attempts to portray Sarah as unreasonable began to backfire with the jury.
After Sarah's testimony concluded, she remained in the courthouse to hear the closing arguments.
Prosecutor Chen methodically laid out the evidence against Castellanos, using recordings, photographs, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses to paint a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had terrorized an entire community. Victor Castellanos believed he could intimidate anyone who stood in his way, Chen told the jury. He believed that threats of violence would make people cower and submit to his demands.
He was wrong.
Sarah Martinez and the other brave individuals who testified in this case proved that communities can fight back against organized crime when they stand together. Harrison Webb's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt and the possibility that the evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. But his arguments felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and money laundering. When the foreman read the verdicts aloud, Castellanos showed no emotion, but Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and vindication. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but legal experts predicted that Castellanos would face at least 25 years in federal prison. Outside the courthouse after the verdict, Sarah was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers from the community. But the person she most wanted to see was Eduardo Vega, the boxing trainer who had taught her to project confidence even when she felt afraid.
"You did it, champ," Eduardo said, embracing her warmly. "You went the distance and won the fight." "We all did it," Sarah corrected him. "This was never just about me."
That evening, Sarah hosted a celebration dinner at Tony Ricci's restaurant for everyone who had helped bring Castellanos to justice. The guest list included FBI agents, prosecutors, community leaders, and dozens of ordinary citizens who had found the courage to testify about their experiences with intimidation and extortion. Roberto offered a toast that captured the mood of the evening, to Sarah Martinez, who proved that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing outside the restaurant with Carmen Rodriguez, looking up at the stars and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment.
"What's next for you?" Carmen asked. "I'm thinking about going back to school," Sarah said. "Maybe studying business or criminal justice. There are other communities dealing with the same problems we faced, and I think I might be able to help them." Carmen smiled. "The student becomes the teacher." "Something like that." As they walked back toward the restaurant, Sarah thought about Miguel and how proud he would have been of what she had accomplished. But she also thought about the future and the possibilities that lay ahead of her. The frightened widow who had hidden from life for 3 years was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had discovered her own strength in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Sarah had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act in spite of fear when something important was at stake. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call that would change her life once again. The caller was Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the director of a non-profit organization that worked with communities fighting organized crime and corruption.
Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Hernandez said, "We've been following your case, and we're impressed by what you and your community accomplished.
We'd like to offer you a position with our organization.
We think your experience and perspective could help other people in similar situations." The offer was tempting, but Sarah asked for time to consider it. She had grown comfortable with her life in the neighborhood, and the thought of leaving felt overwhelming.
That weekend, Sarah visited Miguel's grave for the first time since the trial ended.
She brought fresh flowers and sat beside the headstone for over an hour, telling him about everything that had happened and asking for his guidance about the decision she faced. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something she had never seen before. On the headstone next to Miguel's was inscribed a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." Sarah realized that Miguel was giving her the answer she needed. He had always believed that people should use their talents and experiences to help others, especially when it meant standing up to injustice. 2 months later, Sarah closed the auto repair shop and donated the property to a non-profit organization that would use it to train young people from the neighborhood in automotive repair skills. She kept a small office in the back of the building where she could meet with people who needed help dealing with intimidation and extortion. Her new job with Dr. Hernandez's organization took her to communities across the country where ordinary people were fighting against corruption and organized crime. She shared her story and helped others develop strategies for standing up to bullies and criminals who preyed on fear. During her first year in the new position, Sarah helped coordinate successful efforts to combat corruption in cities as diverse as Detroit, New Orleans, and Phoenix. Each situation was unique, but the underlying dynamics were always the same. Criminals believed they could intimidate people into submission, and communities had to decide whether to fight back or surrender. Sarah's role was to show people that fighting back was possible, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. On the first anniversary of Castellanos' conviction, Sarah returned to the neighborhood for a community celebration. The area had continued to improve over the past year, with new businesses opening and property values rising as people no longer feared criminal intimidation. Mrs. Chen, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, pulled Sarah aside during the celebration. "You know," the elderly woman said, "when my family first came to America 50 years ago, we faced discrimination and threats from people who didn't want us in their neighborhood. Back then, we didn't know how to fight back. We just endured it. Things are different now," Sarah said. "Yes, because of people like you. People who refuse to be victims." That night, Sarah stood in the doorway of what had once been her auto repair shop, now bustling with young people learning valuable job skills. She thought about the journey that had brought her from frightened widow to community advocate. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. There had been moments of doubt and fear, times when she questioned whether the fight was worth the risk. But, looking at the vibrant community around her, Sarah knew that she had made the right choices. Victor Castellanos was serving a 30-year sentence in federal prison. His criminal organization had been dismantled, and the neighborhood was safer than it had been in decades. More importantly, the people who lived and worked there had learned that they didn't have to accept intimidation and corruption as inevitable facts of life. Sarah Martinez had started as the widowmaker, a woman who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. But she had become something much more important, proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to back down from bullies. As she walked through the neighborhood that night, greeting old friends and new neighbors, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. She had learned that the most dangerous person in any confrontation wasn't necessarily the one with the most weapons or the most money. Sometimes, it was simply the one who refused to be intimidated. The widowmaker had become the neighborhood maker, and her story would inspire others for generations to come.